A man, George, is standing by his car on the side of the road, speaking to his girlfriend, Christina, on the phone. They are arguing because he got lost, and Christina sarcastically comments on the ridiculousness of the situation. George gets angry and rebukes her. He apologizes to her, as they both are aware the reason they are irritated with one another is entirely different, and requests her to share the real reason for her ire. She refuses to divulge, and instead asks him to self-reflect, which annoys him further, escalating the argument until they both hang up. Frustrated, George gets into his vintage convertible and drives off in a huff. A little further down the road, he stops, takes a puff from his inhaler to calm himself, and calls his friend Chris. At first, Chris hangs up on him as it's too early, but when George calls back, he curses him but hears him out. George tells him of his fight with Christina and how they were at a friend's engagement party the previous night when they started talking, but then the conversation took a bad turn. Chris blasts him for being insensitive and dragging his feet in proposing to Christina. George argues that he is not ready to commit yet. Chris despairs and wonders why Christina doesn't just leave him already. George disconnects the phone and resumes driving. He drives around the beautiful, scenic, yet lonely roads of Cyprus. Suddenly, he spots a beautiful young woman walking on the side of the road in her wedding dress. He pulls up beside her, unable to contain his shock. He asks her if she needs any help, as she is walking alone in a wedding dress in the middle of nowhere. She hesitates and tries to rush him along. He asks her where she is headed, and she quips to nowhere. He goes along with it and jokes he is headed there too. She still refuses to accept his help. Wishing her luck, George starts driving away, slowly keeping an eye on her in the rearview mirror, in which he spots her as she runs toward him, waving for him to stop. She finally gets in, with effort due to her puffed-up wedding dress and veil. As they drive on, George looks at her curiously. She refuses to appease his curiosity, but wonders aloud if he may be a criminal or a serial murderer. Before he can reassure her, he gets a call from his mom, who scolds him for driving off without informing anyone, and nags him for speaking sharply to her when he tries to stop her tirade. As he disconnects the phone, the girl smirks and looks at him. He smiles back and comments that should have cleared all her doubts about him being a nefarious character. She quips that even Norman Bates, the famous Hitchcock villain, loved his mother. He just shakes his head, and they both smile and continue on the drive. A few hours later, George is still driving while the bride sleeps on the seat beside him. When she wakes up, she realizes they are parked on the side of the road, and George is tinkering with the engine. She wonders if he is a mechanic, and he corrects her assumption by sharing that he is an engineer. She further questions him whether he finally figured out a destination, but George is still unsure. She, on the other hand, mentions a location, Cavo Greco, which is a cliffside with an amazing view. She shares that she needs to be there by sunset. He remarks that the spot is famous for weddings, trying to make her reveal more about herself, but she remains mum. She, on the other hand, tries to guess about George's life and the possible reason for him wandering around with her. She correctly guesses that his girlfriend wants him to propose, and because of his fear of commitment, they got into a fight, and now he is trying to avoid another confrontation. She calls him a cliché and equates herself as one too, but now she wants to change her life. Upset at being called a cliché, George argues with her that he is just happy with his girlfriend and doesn't need a piece of paper to prove that. He further argues his being in a relationship without such a commitment is proof that he is serious about it, and not just obligated due to a contract. The bride diffuses his argument by calling him a commitment phobe. As they resume their drive, George mistakenly assumes that Cavo Greco is her actual wedding location, but she sets him straight. As they talk, she pokes at him and asks him if he loves Christina. George avoids the question and argues with her. She advises him to call Christina and clear the air soon, or else he will regret it later. Even as he contemplates her words, he points out her perilous situation. A gust of wind makes her veil fly right off. George pulls up as she runs back to get it. When she leaves, he calls up Christina, and they are talking when the bride rushes back to him. Excited to find her veil, she jumps at him in joy, and Christina overhears her voice. She starts questioning George about the woman he is with. George tries to explain to her the situation, but she gets annoyed and hangs up on him. The bride realizes her mistake and apologizes. After the debacle, as George and the bride sit in the car, avoiding speaking to each other. After a few minutes, she offers to speak to Christina on George's behalf to help clear the air for him. George refuses her help. A little further down the road, the car comes to a forced stop, and they realize it has run out of gas. As they start walking toward the gas station, which is about 2 kilometers away as per a signboard, George retries to calling Christina, but she does not pick up. As they walk, George tells the story of how he met Christina through his best friend Chris. Chris introduced them, as he and Christina are very similar, and so it was likely that she would get along very well with George. He further shares Christina's quirkiness, comparing her to the bride. He says Christina is much more sensible. The bride takes offense at being called too kooky, but they laugh about it and continue. After a certain point, the bride stumbles to a stop, as walking in her wedding stilettos is hurting her, and it becomes unbearably painful. Realizing going back to the car would be even more painful, George carries her piggyback to the station. By the time they arrive at the station, George takes a puff of his inhaler to regain his lost breath. He asks her to wait there while he grabs the petrol and walks back to the car. He promises to return to pick her up. As he walks back to the car with the petrol, George calls up his friend Chris and shares with him his predicament about the bride, and how Christina knows about it too, and won't answer his calls anymore. Chris jokes about George finally going over the edge and offers to come get him, but George reassures him that he is perfectly sane, and will come back home soon. He tries calling Christina, but gets her machine. At the gas station, the bride watches a couple making out and gets irritated with them. She creates a distraction so that they leave. When a cop drives in, she rushes and hides at the back of the gas station. When George arrives, he looks around for her, but cannot find her anywhere. He walks around the gas station and finally finds her sitting out by the restroom stalls. He asks her if she is ready to leave. She asks for a few minutes and pretends to start stretching, claiming stiff muscles from sitting around in the car for so long. George walks back and waits by the car, noticing that she keeps an eye out for the cop, and when he leaves, she comes back to the car. He is curious, but does not say anything. When they are back on the road, he finally asks her about it. After avoiding it for a bit, she shares that her fiancé is a cop, so he might have sent his colleagues to look out for her. She further explains that she left without informing anyone. She continues telling her story of the day, how it was supposed to be her wedding day, but when she woke up, she thought about the day after the wedding and panicked. Up until then, for the entire year, she had been so busy planning the wedding she never thought about the day after, and when she finally did think about it that morning, she realized her life is about to become just another conventional story of marriage, followed by children, and the various responsibilities that will come with that. She could see no excitement or adventure in her future, and that scares her. George, on the other hand, speaks in favor of stability and predictability. The bride disagrees with him and claims that a little adventure makes life worth living. He advises her to at least inform her parents, but the bride refuses, as she feels unprepared to face them. George jokes with her about her bridal garter to cheer her up, as they once again set off for Cavo Greco. He again asks her name, but she plays coy and hides it. As they drive through the beautiful streets of Cyprus, they discuss love. George claims that love is an illusion, a temporary infatuation. He gives examples of classic love stories, and how each ended in separation. The bride passionately argues in favor of love, claiming love is the base for everything in life, the reason why empires were built and destroyed, as she tries to convince him of her point of view. The discussion turns into a heated argument, which ends in the bride getting out of the car and walking away in a huff as George looks on, amused. He just waits there for her. Suddenly, she returns and calmly gets back in the car. When he asks about it, she tells him she is scared of goats. Just then, a herd of goats passes by the car, and George bursts out laughing. They resume their journey, and also the discussion. George asks the bride about feeling the magical love that she so craves, with her fiancé. She shares that she thought it was a magical kind of love, but later realized it isn't the movie kind of love that she wants. George hears her and despairs about the romantic notions that women have developed after watching movies. He believes movies to be the culprits in raising unreasonable expectations, and an actual romance of that kind is impossible. The bride gets annoyed, but when she sees they are driving close to the beach, she asks him to stop. She hands him her shoes and runs off to the water to play with the surf, while George looks on, charmed by her childlike innocence. When she returns to the car, she finds him tinkering with the radio, trying to catch some news. She tries to help, but breaks it, much to George's shock. He scolds her for being careless with it, as it is a vintage piece and will be difficult to replace. The bride apologizes, chagrined. George takes the opportunity to make her aware that the consequences of her thoughtless actions could ruin her fiancé's life. She shows no remorse or guilt about it, and instead questions his right to comment on love, as he does not believe in it, setting George off into explaining how love is just science, merely a chemical reaction in line with the purpose of our species, which is to continue its existence by procreating. He goes into a tirade about how love is just a hormone-induced state that makes people addicted to it. Completely uninterested, the bride plays with his wallet and laughs at the photo inside. All the while, George continues to talk about the chemicals that love releases in the human brain, like dopamine and oxytocin. In the middle of his tirade, she asks about his father, and caught off guard, he informs her that he has no idea about his father's whereabouts. Trying to act nonchalant, he continues, and calls love a survival mechanism for humans. The bride understands that his father's abandonment of him and his mother may be the crux of his aversion to commit, and to believe in love as a genuine emotion. As they continue further, after some time George feels sleepy, and almost drives off the road. The bride, worried, asks him to pull over, but he insists on continuing, until she threatens to start singing a song to irritate him. He does not believe her, but when she does exactly that, he gives up and stops at the side of the road. Annoyed with her, he steps out of the car. She gets into the driver's seat while George is walking off his fatigue. When he tries to get in, she drives away. George calls after her. She returns, laughing, and once again does the same when he moves to open the door. He yells after her, and she finally stops. George takes a nap, and when he wakes up, he finds them in the middle of the desert. He rushes out and asks her about it. She remains unaffected by his concern, and instead encourages him to enjoy the quietness and serenity of being in the middle of a desert with no one around. Enjoying her moment, she asks him for a dance, and insists that her dress deserves a dance. George comments on it being too hot for her to be wearing her dress and the gloves, but she refuses to remove them, as they go with the outfit. George just walks away, not willing to take any more of her craziness. She waits a few more moments and walks back, annoyed at him for not participating. When she gets back into the car, she removes the petticoats from under the dress and leaves them behind. Back on the road, George answers her questions about dating her if he were single, and jokes that she may be too kooky for him, but then he seriously accepts that she is very attractive. They both smile and have a nice moment. Sometime later, Christina finally calls George back. In his hurry to reassure her to not worry about the bride, he carelessly calls her a nobody, which hurts the bride. Christina asks him to meet her at their usual spot that night, and warns him that it will be their final discussion, as she is not willing to wait any longer. George agrees to meet her. After the phone call, when George displays doubt about the meeting with Christina, as he is unsure about his feelings, the bride scolds him to stop worrying about the future, and instead focus on the love he feels for Christina. George, still needing some time, decides to continue driving down to Cavo Greco. A little while later, they reach a little village and walk around looking for food. They meet a couple of old men playing chess, who give them a map of Cyprus. As they sit outside a building, the bride eating while George looks over the map, the bride shares how her fiancé proposed to her in a restaurant in front of the waiter, and even though it was a very old-fashioned proposal, she had been so happy that she readily accepted. She also explains to George the difference between being involved with someone and being committed in a relationship. She shares an example of her friend, who told her he would hide the ring in the glove box and propose to his girlfriend as a surprise on a drive. She asks for George's idea of a perfect proposal, and he hesitates, as he has no idea, or has never thought about it. He would simply ask without any fanfare. Just then, a priest walks up to them, and they realize they are seated outside a church. He mistakenly takes them to be a to-be-married couple, and George jokingly tells him that they have run away together. They continue the conversation in the car when the bride figures out that George has bought a ring. She gets confused by his reluctance to propose to Christina, despite buying a ring. George explains that he bought the ring with the thought that it may make it easier for him to muster up the courage to propose to Christina. As they are discussing this, the bride plays with the ring and wants to try it on, but George stops her, and in the ensuing scuffle she drops it outside by mistake. As they stop to look for it, George calls the bride irresponsible, not only for the ring, but also for running out on her wedding day without informing anyone and not feeling guilty about it. The bride in turn calls him a coward who was so afraid of the future that he did not even try to act out of the ordinary, and remained stuck up in his ways. The argument escalates, and George blames her for his indecision. He says that he is afraid of giving Christina false hopes and ideas by supporting a non-existent fantasy of a happily ever after, when he knows it is far from the truth, and in reality, people don't stay forever. The bride is hurt by his harsh words and starts walking away. George too feels frustrated and angry with her, and so drives off, leaving her. He keeps driving away, still upset and angry, and then stops and returns for her. When he arrives, he finds her sitting under a tree waiting for him. They set off once again. A few minutes later, George gets a call from his mother. She starts nagging him for missing lunch and for dragging his feet and proposing to Christina. Seeing him getting scolded by his mother, the bride grabs the phone and speaks to his mother, calling herself his friend. She reassures his mom that he is a good man, and that she raised him well, as he would never abandon anyone in need. Christina is lucky to have such a considerate man in her life. She pretends to lose connection and disconnects the call. George thanks her for it, and they both start laughing at the absurdity of the whole thing. Anger forgotten, they happily continue down the drive like old friends. The bride lets the wind blow away her veil, embracing freedom and willingness to move on. Like long-lost friends, they discuss their favorites, in terms of music, books, artists, and paintings. They talk about their likes and dislikes, and get to know each other more. Later, they make a quick stop as George needs to relieve himself. He gets a call from Chris. Chris berates George for leaving him to handle his mess, claiming that George's mother kept calling him, asking for George's whereabouts. George informs him that he is on his way to Cavo Greco, and then will drop off the bride where she needs to go, and finally go to meet Christina. That is if, by then, he feels like it is the right thing to do. Later, he asks for the bride's advice on what he should do about his relationship with Christina. The bride advises him to be brave and be honest with her, no matter what he decides. If he decides to stay in the relationship, he should commit to her, and if he decides otherwise, he should tell her truthfully. After their conversation, the bride becomes sad, thinking about her situation. George catches onto her feelings and stops the car. He asks her to step out, and when she does, he leads her into a dance. She feels better, and she lays her head on his shoulder while they dance. She finally tells him her name is Eva. Back on the road, they debate about fate and free will. Eva says she believes their meeting today was fate, while George feels it was free will. They stop when they find a box in the middle of the road. There is a puppy in it. Eva picks it up and brings it along, but George argues that it is a huge responsibility. Just then, he notices that her wrist under the gloves is bleeding. When he asks her to check it, she avoids it and brushes him off, calling it an old injury. A little further, George stops at a roadside store to get a bandage and flip-flops for her. He is about to get a leash for the pup when he spots Eva's picture in a newspaper on the stand. The newspaper states that she is a mental patient who has escaped, further elaborating her story of having a nervous breakdown after being abandoned at the altar by her fiancé on her wedding day the year before. George is in shock after reading the news. He goes back to the car, but does not say anything and starts driving. After driving a bit further, he stops under the guise of wanting to pee and walks away from her to call Chris. He informs Chris about the situation, and Chris makes him realize that he is driving to Cavo Greco, which is a cliff, with a woman who is... George is extremely worried about Eva and starts defending her escape from the mental institute, claiming it could be for a good reason, much to Chris's amazement. When they finally reach Cavo Greco, George tells her he knows about her situation and asks her why she wants to go there. He worries she may hurt herself, so when she rushes out of the car, he follows her and stops her. They struggle, and she pushes him away. She confesses to him that she wanted to go there just to remember who she was, before all the bad stuff happened to her, before her nervous breakdown. She just wanted to feel like herself again, and not a mental patient. George calmly removes her gloves and finds the bandaged wrists underneath. He takes her hand and walks her to the edge of the cliff. Together, they look at the stunning view as the sun sets. Eva realizes she still needs help, and has not yet completely recovered. She requests George to take her back to the hospital. They drive back in silence. When they reach the hospital, Eva worries about the puppy. George promises to adopt him, taking his first step toward commitment. Eva hugs him and asks him to be brave and truthful to Christina. As she starts walking away, George stops her and kisses her. They share a poignant goodbye. As she walks away, she turns around and quotes her favorite quote, "And those who seemed to be dancing were thought to be insane by those who couldn't hear the music." George smiles and is about to leave when he spots a red garter, Eva's wedding garter, that she left for him in the car. He shakes his head in fond amusement.